when thematically or chronologically it fits in a history lesson.
Can I ask, is there any good, on that same topic, is there other good literature that teachers are using? Fiction? Are there any good short stories?
I think Netherland by Joseph O'Neill is a wonderful 9/11 book. It's heartbreaking, but it's, on the surface level, the story of this, of like crickets and immigrants, but it's really beautiful. And it's really heartbreaking, the parts. It's very subtle in how it threads September 11th throughout the entire story, but it's a very present for me.
Who's the author?
Joseph O'Neill?
Yeah.
Am I correct in that?
Yeah.
It's one of the most beautifully written books in the last 10 years. And you can just pick any page up, and it's just gorgeous to read.
I mean, especially in comparison, to the Jonathan Safran Foer book, right, which is just like so heavy. I mean, this is just, it's very beautiful.
Yeah.
Man Illusions of Gatsby.
Exactly. It's gorgeous.
I wonder if I may make a suggestion. I'm so intrigued by your population, the population you teach. What a joy it must be.
Oh, it's great.
I start my American survey course with a week on this notion of Americanness. What does it mean even to be an American?
That was very much, it's often the first project, especially when I taught 12th grade, of what is American and who is an American.
And the different voices over the centuries, from de Krefker to Obama's memoir, of what this thing, this elusive thing called the American identity is. And it just seems that this fits so beautifully into that, and tragically, because we define ourselves most at moments of tragedy. And it seems like a great entry point for your students in particular.
Yeah, I think I said this a little bit, and I'm always a little bit wary as to what's going to be said when bringing it up. I mean, I have students from Afghanistan, I have students from Pakistan, I have students who choose to cover their head, I have students who try to bully other students into covering their heads who don't want to be. Students are very open about their background. I have some students who are like, I don't really know what this is. And then, because they're so new to language, and our classrooms are heterogeneously mixed, additionally on English level, there's just a simple level of being understood that any subtlety, any sort of, it's all very blunt, and so it's thinking that, for me, I get sort of nervous that something's going to be said that someone's going to take an offense of when it's not intended that way. And I think that runs through the school and many, many issues, but with things that, we were looking at the New York Times page, it's called, I think, The Reckoning, right? They have the thematic page for September 11th, and I'm looking at that, and there's just so much there of what it's triggering for people, how it affected their family, what issues are being brought up on a personal level, as well as just identity, because, everyone's being thrown into this room at the same time together, so it's careful.
Are you going to put your hand, or you have something?
Oh, no.
Go.
Somebody in the audience. Say something.
No, I just had a comment on the chronology, and I've dealt with this where I taught a humanities course out in Santa Monica for 10 years, and it was like history and literature combined, and we did Russia, and it's like Russian literature and Mongols and fear of the outsider and everything built, and it was awesome, but there's times where you feel like, I didn't cover this piece. And when you're doing history and you go away from chronology, there's fear that you didn't give due respect or coverage to a certain event, and so that debate is always going on in my mind. But I had a parent recently who told me that he grew up in rural Georgia in the 60s, African American guy, and the library with all the books burned down. They had no books for the school, and his history teacher in 7th grade taught the history course in the Atlantic Constitution Journal every day, and it was like his favorite course of all time. And every time I think I bring up current events with my middle schoolers, they're way more interested than like history. Some kids are really geeked out in history, but many kids are turned off because it's a memorization of facts and a march through time. But so I think there is something like freedom of sort of going to the current events and going back in time. Yet I think, as you said, Aaron, it feels at times a little too big and unwieldy, and you don't feel like necessarily you're like anchored to something. But I think that can be okay.
It's how I learned. You know,
Yeah.
it's how I learned in high school. It's how I learned through my undergraduate degree. And so for me, it makes sense. But I know for many people, it's uncomfortable to let go of those reins of having that path to follow.
It's a shift of memorizing, like, here's what happened and here's the knowledge of what happened, I think, versus like an exploration of what did happen. Very open-ended, and that's a little too, sometimes hard as well.
Well, even when you don't view history as a collection of facts, or you don't put your weight on rote memorization, which we don't do, there's also the deception that I think a lot of us participate in, that coverage means retention. That just because we've covered it, they know it. And increasingly, I'm thinking of ways to really track their retention and their growth as learners, whether it be in terms of skills or in terms of content. I think this illusion that if we talk about an historical event for, what do I have for World War I? 4 days? Then they got it. Really? What did they get? I think we need to get better at identifying what they've retained.
Sounds depressing.
Yeah. Well, then if you teach them the skills to how to sort of keep the conversation going, then I can live with that a little
I
easier.
just wanted to put out something here that's just totally different perspective, which is that I took a course on in facing history and facing ourselves on 9/11, and I went back with a teacher from Spanish Harlem, and she said, you know, for the kids I teach, this is not a relevant event. A lot of those students had relatives that died in the plane that was headed for the Caribbean, that went down. They all worried, was it another terror, and their community was devastated. Whereas 9/11 was a lot of rich people working in office buildings, and my sister works with a homeless population in Maryland, and she sort of said the same thing. For people who are, you know, where am I getting the next bit of food? You know, this is America also. This event did not necessarily resonate in ways that we're assuming that it did. And I'm not sure if these are just personal stories, I don't know, but when I heard it, it did sort of make me think, well, you know, wait a minute, maybe, you know, maybe we're thinking of a more selected population and aren't thinking about what everybody's life is like in America and what kind of impacts. I was just throwing it out there.
Which is a valid point.
So.
Sorry, go ahead. I just found it curious because I was going to say, you know, I taught junior high for a while, and I taught U.S. history there, and there was a real lack of love for it, and so teaching is story-based, but you know, whenever students have an interest in something, then it perks them up, right? Whichever way that you get them to do this. But I used to, and I still occasionally do, teach photography. So there's always photo books in my classroom, and the stuff with September 11th immediately draws students to it, and a range of students. And so I was going to say that the interest really is there, if just on a like, you know, this is astounding to look at. I mean, I sat in the back and I watched all of us flinch this morning, right? And almost couldn't go through it the second time with a second movie clip. But so it draws students to it. It's then like, what do you do and where do you move? If you start with that, and here's where some interest lies with students, and I can help get them to this point, right, of understanding the history, which will lead them to want to know about another event or another time period in history or another culture. How do you keep that going? So it's interesting to hear of like, it's not reaching everyone.
I'm just sharing these are anecdotes, but they made me think in a way.
I defer to you because I knew I was going to be annoying on this point as well, and that is, I've debated long and hard and will continue to do so with my colleagues. To what extent do we worry about their hook or their personal connection with a body of literature or knowledge or whatever? And to what extent do we have to foster that connection? So, in other words, do we only teach them things that they recognize them? This happens with English teachers all the time. Do I teach them multicultural literature because they recognize themselves in, you know, this
relevance?
Exactly. As opposed to, you know, Tom Sawyer. What do they have in common with Tom Sawyer? It's an ongoing debate, and I think if we're honest with each other and ourselves, we have to do both. You know, and it's really hard. I'm sorry.
trying to get awareness.
I think some themes are universal,
Mm-hmm.
so I think that they will find themselves, they will see themselves in whatever it is that you can teach them if you approach it the right way. But in terms of minorities and poor people, and I think they felt it afterwards when. I don't know if I should call it a police state, but when New York became, when you saw the police going, or the military going around with machine guns, as a minority, as a poor person, you felt you were being attacked in a sense. Someone mentioned having to take your shoes off, or I think you did, and opening your bags, randomly searches, and randomly they're searching people randomly, which is, I think, it's not really random. They felt that, so they can identify with that. It's more what happened after 9/11 that really got to them.
On that subject, because someone raised the question of resource materials, it's not a 9/11 book by any stretch, but, well, by the stretch I'm going to mention, which is Mustafa Bayomi's How Does It Feel to Be a Problem, which is, I'm seeing nodding heads, so many of you know about it already, I've probably mentioned it, but I think it would be very useful in, talking about the aftermath of 9/11. It's basically 7 or 8 stories of young Muslim Arab, young Muslim Arabs in Brooklyn, and what their experience is, and in post 9/11 New York City. So, and it's kind of told from their perspectives. So, it's a very interesting book, and one that I think students would like reading. I just had been meaning to mention that, and as I started talking, I saw 5 hands, and I don't know whose they were. Brands, at least.
I'm just going to have like 1 second. The one other way I was thinking for minorities is that once the wars begin, coming back to that, who is affected by military service would be another way right away that jumps out.
Right. Here, Sarah.
Sort of drawing on this idea of Arab Americans in New York City and elsewhere, and also just the wider Middle East, I'm wondering how much weight and time is really devoted to focusing on 9/11 as the central point of how the Middle East is taught, and in that case, is that sort of perpetuating an American-centric view of the Middle East, and putting too much focus on Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden when there's this huge, there's so many ideologies, and so how do you sort of put the Middle East or put 9/11, for instance, in proportionate context to the larger Middle East, and instead of just kind of accentuating this topic that most Americans already know about, maybe they don't know accurately, but there's a lot about the Middle East that so few Americans have ever even. Sorry, that's a lot of questions.
So it's a question I've thought about a lot. So in my modern Middle East survey class, it's 1 day. There's a couple of other days where we look at U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East as well. I would say it would be a disservice not to do it, but I think it's an incredible problem if you emphasize it too much. And the same thing in a way in the 10th grade, I talked about what I do. It really only comes down to a day in class and a take-home assignment, that there's time there. I think you're entirely right. If you come back to it too much, you really just perpetuate that notion about America as the world and where it matters. And it's not.
Yeah, I figured because this is a 9/11 seminar that's probably why, that's the thing that's being talked about.
In my Middle East class, we cover 19th century Western imperial. We actually start with Said, Orientalism, 19th century imperialism, and the Ottomans, and etc. And then the Israel-Palestine conflict, Iran, women, so again, and oil and water. I do oil, water, and then U.S. foreign policy. So it's a hodgepodge, but one has a sense that maybe in that they'll find some sense of the variety of the issues.
Well, and also this very center, this is the first one, isn't it? More or less the first.
The first Middle
The
East.
first,
that
the first day that you picked this as a topic. I mean, there've been
Oh,
such a wealth of
right.
other
Right.
topics.
I've been doing educational outreach for now over a decade, and this is the very first
Yeah,
9/11
so that's
thing I've
another
ever done.
answer
Yeah.
to that question.
Yeah.
This may be making it sound more central than
Right.
it's been.
Yeah, but I have a tendency, and I'm feeling uncomfortable with this camera.
We're gonna keep
But
it.
I definitely have almost an aversion. I mean, this is just my personal view. I have an aversion to thinking about or to really focusing everyone's attention on 9/11, and I think that's just because of the resulting conversation often gets dragged down into what I think are problematic and unproductive conversations about religious fundamentalism, or if you're not with us, you're with them sort of mentality that I think many of us actually suffer from, even if we don't. You know what I mean? So I feel it's a very polarizing thing to discuss, and often with polarizing things, we don't make progress. So I mean, it's kind of. However, I found this session today amazingly productive, and I think we are talking in very sophisticated ways about all of these issues. So perhaps I needed to do it sooner.
I think also I'd say that I think that it relates in this way, that it creates the climate in which you're able to or not able to talk about the whole Islamic experience. In other words, like it shouldn't, but it does because it's it's such a defining event. And so I think in a way, it's more than an event. It sort of creates the climate that makes it difficult to do the kind of things that we're trying to do. I think the other thing I would just say is I think that I guess I think of it as sort of a reverse almost, not like it's something that's going to dominate the way you study Islamic history, but that there should be some Middle Eastern history to the teaching about 9/11. It seems like there's been a kind of like a divorce,
Right.
at least in the public space, about the Middle Eastern knowledge and commemoration. So in a way, but I understand exactly what you're saying. I think it's like the thing that's most distorted people's perceptions about this whole field. But I think, by the way, I should also add that the way I experience this is with in the New York City public schools, is very soon after this they banned Khalidi from going out to public schools and doing professional development. It's kind of been a clamp down on academic freedom to some degree. So I don't know. I understand. I mean, that obviously it's a little bit like a parallel to understanding Jewish history by just looking at the Holocaust. This sort of similar kind of problematic thing. But it's like this huge elephant in the room that you can't really avoid. So I don't think it should take over, but I think to try to figure it out is important.
No, I was just going to say, I know several of us who teach in the independent schools and teach a designated Middle East history semester class or something like that. We use the James Gelman textbook, and as sort of Bram was saying, he opens sort of that introduction referencing 9/11 as the context through which Americans, whether students or those of us who are no longer students, the lens that we often look at, the Middle East through. And it reminds me of one of the sessions that I did here on teaching the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and kind of just sometimes the first day of class, just word association. When I say the word Middle East, what comes to mind? And so, of course, they're going to say terrorists, 9/11, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's like you have to acknowledge that from the beginning, of the very beginning days of a class, because by not acknowledging it certainly doesn't make it go away. It has to sort of let's identify that this is the stereotype, and then the rest of the semester going through and going back to early Ottomans and the centuries of then Middle Eastern history that you then try to get through for the course of the semester. As Professor Cohen was saying, like building the history of the Middle East, where you end up then revisiting or ending up at the events of 9/11, but not as this is an inevitable march towards this event, but this is what happens in the 21st century, one event of several that all of this history and all of these factors and all of these influences have created a context for, or created a moment in which the U.S. is doing this, certain actors are doing that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So it does kind of tie it back while looking, certainly taking a very historical, critical perspective on the events of history, but acknowledging our perspective that we are, or our approach, not our perspective, but yeah, I guess maybe our perspective, that we can't necessarily help because we are Americans living in this moment in time, bombarded by certain media images, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So,
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the things I think we're not talking about, which I think is, is an education issue, is that most people in America really either knew nothing and didn't want to know anything about Islam until 2001. And if our schools and what we taught and how we taught it had already provided a real background, in world perspectives and world religions, including Islam, this wouldn't have happened. And, whether we've really made progress or not in educating the public or educating our students since then, but I mean, that was the catalyst moment for, the other professor here said that. Kevorkian was one of the first ones in New York City to really make that outreach, and, so.
Yeah, because what I think we're seeing now, not everyone is doing it this way, but, actually my first job in this field probably only was created because of 9/11, because the U.S. government expanded funding for centers like this one. My first job was at Yale University. They had never had a Middle East center.
Really?
And they got funding in 2002, I suppose. I can't remember the exact cycle. Then they created a position, I got hired. And there are lots of stories like that. I think there are lots of, and that model of education really came about from a Cold War mentality of kind of needing to understand the enemy and needing to learn the languages of the enemy and so forth. And I've also seen since 9/11, I don't know how many of you who are teaching Middle East electives, if it predated 9/11 or came after. And so you see, younger levels of schools starting Arabic lessons, starting all these things. And there are so many wonderful benefits of that, right? But what I think teaching about anything related to the Middle East region right now in this moment is kind of stemming from the same climate that was created that has, good and bad results in the because of the post 9/11 kind of understanding of the world and what's important for us to know and understand. And I think there's a burden because we actually do have a lot of information about the Middle East as a result, but so much of it is misinformation. So if we were thinking about, people have thrown out Latin America as an example in the discussion today, but probably African studies is the least, given the least attention in global curriculum, but certainly in the U.S. And the challenges are different there because you are dealing with a blank slate, and this is something that's come up. Students here don't have a blank slate; they have something, and we're kind of sometimes it helps, sometimes it really hurts.
I don't know how blank it is on Africa. Aren't they just that continent that can't escape from poverty?
Well,
Sure. Students.
Sure, but do they actually know even worse than, I'm sure most students couldn't identify on a map certain places in the Middle East region, but I'm sure it's far worse. And my colleagues in African studies would attest to that, that they just are really out there and there's no funding for their work and this kind of stuff. So we're actually in a good moment that we can take advantage of. However, it has its kind of drawbacks. Yeah.
One other thing that nobody's mentioned that I was curious about was popular culture. It is like all the media images, like, you see people on these TV shows, just like Torch, like 48 and all that. There are ways in which it's had this huge effect on popular culture, movies. The bad guys shifted from being the Russians to Middle Eastern figures. It seems like in my field, they call it an American Studies approach, which would be, thinking about its impact on film and all that too. I wonder if anybody has done any of that or thought about that. In other words, that thinking about the impact this has had, this demonization of agriculture. Is that something that people use to teach with, or not? Like a sort of media studies approach.
I do. I don't do specifically since 9/11, but I mean, we had the workshop here with Real Bad Arabs,
Yeah.
but I use this short little fun mockumentary thing called Planet of the Arabs, actually at the beginning of the year, to get at images of Arabs in US media and what's there. And I think it was made in 2002, 2003, I don't know if anyone knows. So it was sort of with 9/11 in mind, but it's mostly images from the 90s. And there was a lot of bad references to Arabs in the 90s as well in the media.
It
So,
started in the 80s with Reagan.
Yeah.
That's really, and that's when the Arab American organizations really got going on fighting stereotypes of Arab Americans. The original war on terror, but Reagan around hostage and oil.
Yeah. I mean, all of these sentiments, as you say, they've been around. I mean,
Yeah.
they've been around for Arabs and Muslims for a long time,
Yeah.
and they have been around for other groups. They're, you know, it's not a news story that started on 9/11.
We just read in my U.S. history class Roger Williams' letter, the Providence letter with the toleration, and my students were astounded because he talks about the Turks, and this is colonial America. And they say to me, and I'm completely unable to answer, so how many Turks were there in the United States? Does anyone know? I'm just like,
There was
how
one
many?
in New York in the Dutch colony.
And I said, we'd be hard pressed to find that information. But at least he knew they existed. Well, of course, he called them Turks, but maybe they were.
Just the idea of popular media, popular culture. My first year teaching Middle East history, I did do an assignment where I had students, I used some of the Shaheen work, and I had them, my students then had to pick from a list that I had called or created a Middle Eastern film that they then had to view and do a film analysis on. One that was created by, people in the Middle East, coming out of a Middle Eastern film culture, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, as a way to try to break from the stereotypes and kind of, see, hey, they're just like us, kind of like normalize, in some ways, the representation and neutralize maybe in some ways the representation. I mean, to varying degrees of success for sure, but I think trying to use materials from the region versus just always being like, here's another American film or another American representation. How are people representing themselves in their own culture?
I always think about it as just I was talking to someone recently about this, of just the Twin Towers as a place. Like all the people who were born and lived in New York before it was built, and that, and watched it come up. But also just like, we were just talking about what a World Trade Center is, and that's going to be sort of this odd concept very soon in the way that it existed here. But that it was also just a huge, massive land. And so we think of it as two tall buildings, but it was just tons that went around to that. And I think I always use the Sonic Memorial because it's talking about like going to windows on the world and like, the stewardesses that were hired to take people up and then it was built, and like this history of a place. And so thinking of a city and its impact on a city, if you want to move the conversation or the study in that way. And so not to detract from like stereotypes of Arab Americans or Muslims, but just that idea of place is really enriched in this idea of 9/11 as well. On the city as a whole, but just also what that building was. There was a mall, like right there. It was just that huge, atrium and space where people interacted with that's not there.
Greta, you did a wonderful seminar on Arab film, remember, about 2
Yeah.
years ago?
Mm-hmm.
Art East, is it?
Yeah, we did something on Arab cinema. Mm-hmm. Yeah, at the college level, of course, we have tons of stuff on this, on the question of popular culture and, cultural production of stuff that we can consume, media, art. And so when I have the opportunity, and I think it's more or less accessible, I think in varying degrees it is, right? I'm remembering one film at that session that was,
I've used,
but probably not the one that was borderline pornographic, I can't remember.
No, Secrets of the Palace.
Silence of the Palaces.
Your library has given me, Kevorkian has a lending library they've sent me amazing films for an independent study that I've done with a student. on women in Arab cinema. So you have a trove of resources.
We do, if you remember to ask, and we try to look
Oh, they're
quickly for
amazing.
stuff. So take advantage of that, which reminds me, in terms of Leslie Woodhead's films,